If I had to pinpoint the exact moment my life changed forever, it would be the day I met Melissa. You know how people talk about love at first sight? I always thought it was just a romanticized cliché, something out of cheesy movies or overly sentimental novels. That is, until it happened to me. We met during our university days, a time when life was full of promise, and the world felt limitless. I wasn't what you'd call a standout guy. I came from a modest background, raised in a two-room apartment where privacy was a luxury and our family dinners were simple but hearty. My parents worked hard to keep food on the table, and I worked just as hard juggling part-time jobs to afford my tuition. Melissa, though, was in a league of her own. She was the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. Her laughter was infectious, her smile magnetic, and she carried herself with a confidence I could never dream of possessing. On campus, she was something of a legend, beautiful, intelligent, and effortlessly kind. She came from a wealthy family, the kind that owned homes in multiple cities and took annual vacations abroad. Meanwhile, I was the guy who considered a rare dinner out at a local diner to be a splurge. The first time I saw her was in the university library. I remember it vividly because it felt like the world had slowed down for a brief moment. She walked in with a couple of friends, her laugh ringing out in the hushed room like a melody. I tried to focus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting back to her. She didn't notice me, of course. Why would someone like her look twice at someone like me? I told myself it was just a fleeting crush and buried my head back in my notes. Fate, however, had other plans. A week later, we were paired together for a group project. When I saw her name next to mine, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Me? Paired with Melissa? It felt surreal. Our first meeting was awkward, at least for me. I could barely get a coherent sentence out without tripping over my words. But Melissa had this way of putting people at ease. She didn't treat me like some nobody, she treated me like an equal. She asked about my life, listened intently, and laughed at my awkward jokes. By the end of that first session, I felt like I had known her for years. As the weeks went by, we spent more and more time together, working on the project and grabbing coffee afterward. She was nothing like I expected. For someone who came from so much privilege, she was surprisingly grounded. She didn't care about material things or status. What she valued was authenticity, hard work, and kindness. One evening, after a particularly long study session, we took a walk around campus. The sky was a deep navy, dotted with stars, and the air was crisp but not too cold. We talked about our dreams, our fears, and everything in between. At one point, she turned to me and said, "You know, you shouldn't sell yourself short. You've got so much potential. You just need to believe in yourself." That moment stayed with me. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. For the first time, I felt seen, not just as the scrappy kid from a modest family, but as someone who could actually make something of himself. Our friendship turned into something more a few weeks later. It wasn't some grand, dramatic declaration of love. It was simple, almost understated. One day, as we were walking back from the library, she slipped her hand into mine. I looked at her, surprised, and she just smiled. "Is this okay?" she asked, her voice soft and uncertain. Of course, it was more than okay. It was everything. We started dating after that, and it was like living in a dream. We didn't have much money, her parents insisted she manage her own finances during college, but we made do. Friday nights were for cheap takeout and Netflix marathons. Weekends were spent exploring the city, finding free museums or parks to visit. Every moment with her felt special, like we were building our own little world. Melissa had a way of making even the mundane feel extraordinary. She'd turn a trip to the grocery store into an adventure or make a lazy Sunday afternoon feel like the most romantic day of my life. I fell for her completely, and I couldn't believe my luck that she felt the same way about me. Her family eventually found out about us, and while her mom was warm and welcoming, her dad was less enthusiastic. He didn't say it outright, but it was clear he didn't think I was good enough for his daughter. But Melissa didn't care. "It's us against the world," she'd say, squeezing my hand, and I believed her. By the time we graduated, our relationship had only grown stronger. We talked about the future constantly, our careers, where we wanted to live, whether we'd get a dog or a cat. We were partners in every sense of the word, and I genuinely thought we were invincible. Graduation day felt like the culmination of everything Melissa and I had worked toward, not just academically, but as a couple. As I stood there in my ill-fitting gown and cap, waiting for my name to be called, I glanced over at her sitting with the other graduates. Even in the sea of robes, she stood out, her radiant smile shining through the crowd. When the ceremony was over, we celebrated with our families. Her parents had rented out a gorgeous banquet hall, complete with twinkling lights and a catered meal that made my mom's jaw drop. I still remember my dad tugging at his tie uncomfortably, muttering about how he felt out of place among the suits and pearls. But Melissa made sure everyone felt welcome. She spent as much time laughing with my parents as she did mingling with her own family's friends. A few weeks later, Melissa and I got married. It wasn't a huge wedding, not by her family's standards, at least. But for me, it was the grandest event I'd ever been a part of. The ceremony took place in a beautiful garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and a soft breeze that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Seeing her walk down the aisle, I felt like the luckiest man alive. She was breathtaking, her white dress flowing like water, her face glowing with happiness. And when she reached me and took my hands, I knew that no matter what happened, this was the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. After the vows and the tears, yes, I cried, don't judge me, we danced the night away under a canopy of stars. Her father gave a speech that was, let's call it, polite. He congratulated us, but there was an edge to his words, a subtle reminder of our different backgrounds. Melissa brushed it off, as always, and whispered in my ear, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. It's just you and me. Then came the surprise. As the reception wound down, her parents pulled us aside and handed us a set of keys. "This is our wedding gift to you," her mom said with a warm smile. I was confused at first, but Melissa's eyes lit up with realization. Her dad cleared his throat and explained, it's a house. A small one, but it's in a nice neighborhood. We thought it would be a good start for you too. I was stunned. A house? I'd been preparing for us to rent a tiny apartment somewhere, scraping by on whatever entry-level job I could land. But here they were, handing us the keys to our future. Melissa hugged her parents, tears in her eyes, and I managed a heartfelt thank you despite feeling completely overwhelmed. It was a generous gift, no doubt about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it came with unspoken expectations, especially from her father. When we first walked into the house a week later, I felt a mix of awe and discomfort. It was small by her family's standards but felt like a mansion to me. Hardwood floors, a cute little kitchen, and a backyard big enough for a barbecue, this wasn't just a house, it was a home. Melissa was over the moon, already talking about how we'd decorate and what furniture we needed to buy. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. I tried to match her enthusiasm, but a small part of me felt uneasy. This house wasn't something I had earned. It was a gift, yes, but it was also a reminder of the gap between Melissa's world and mine. Still, I was determined to make it ours. Melissa and I spent the first few months settling in, painting the walls, assembling furniture, and turning the house into a reflection of us. We hosted small dinners for our friends, started a little herb garden in the backyard, and spent countless nights talking about our dreams for the future. Life was good, simple, happy, and full of promise. Or so I thought. After the honeymoon phase of our marriage began to settle, reality came knocking. Melissa and I were living in the cozy little house her parents had gifted us, and while it was a dream come true, it also came with responsibilities, bills, groceries, and maintenance. Melissa had found a job quickly, something in the creative field she loved. Her enthusiasm for her work was contagious, and I was proud of her. As for me, things weren't going as smoothly. I thought finding a decent job after graduation would be easy. I'd earned a respectable degree and worked hard, but every interview seemed to end the same way, with polite smiles and a "we'll be in touch." Weeks turned into months, and my confidence began to waver. Melissa was supportive at first, always reassuring me that something would come along. But I could tell she was starting to worry too. The pressure of being unemployed started to gnaw at me. Our expenses weren't extravagant, but I hated the idea of Melissa carrying the financial weight alone. I wanted to contribute, to prove that I could be the provider she believed I was capable of being. One day, after another frustrating interview, I found myself walking past a warehouse with a sign that read, "Help wanted, loaders needed." It wasn't the kind of job I'd envisioned for myself, but the pay was decent, and they were hiring on the spot. I hesitated. This wasn't what I'd worked so hard in school for. But then I thought about Melissa, about the life we were trying to build together. I walked in and applied on the spot. Within an hour, I was hired and scheduled to start the next morning. At first, I planned to tell Melissa. But the more I thought about it, the more ashamed I felt. She'd married someone she believed would build a bright future with her, not someone working manual labor. So, I decided to keep it a secret. My days became a juggling act. I'd leave the house in business attire, pretending I was going to yet another interview. Then I'd change in my car and head to the warehouse, where I'd spend hours lifting crates and stacking pallets. The work was grueling, leaving my body sore and my pride bruised. But at the end of each shift, I felt a small sense of accomplishment. When I came home, Melissa would ask about my day, and I'd feed her vague stories about job prospects and networking. It wasn't a complete lie. Sometimes, I did attend interviews before or after my shifts. But the weight of the secret started to take its toll. There were moments when I wanted to tell her the truth, to explain that I was doing this for us. But every time I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come out. I told myself it was temporary, that as soon as I found something better, I'd come clean. But temporary stretched into weeks, then months. The warehouse job wasn't exactly stable, and my hours were unpredictable. I'd sometimes get called in late at night or on weekends, forcing me to come up with more excuses for my absence. One evening, Melissa mentioned that her parents wanted to have us over for dinner. My heart sank. I'd been avoiding any interactions with her parents, worried that they'd see through my act. But Melissa was excited, saying, "They're just proud of us and want to hear how we're doing." That dinner was one of the most nerve-wracking nights of my life. Her father, ever the skeptic, grilled me about my career. I kept my answers vague, talking about exploring options and waiting for the right opportunity. He didn't seem convinced, but Melissa, ever supportive, chimed in with, "He's being smart, Dad. He doesn't want to settle." I don't know if it was guilt or pride, but something about her faith in me made the lie even harder to carry. I resolved then and there to double my efforts to find a better job, something worthy of the man Melissa believed I was. As the weeks went on, I threw myself into the job search with renewed determination. Every break at the warehouse was spent scouring job boards or sending out resumes. I started taking on extra shifts to save up more money, hoping it would buy me a little more time. But the secret was beginning to crack. My hands were constantly calloused, my muscles sore. Melissa started noticing how tired I seemed, asking if I was feeling okay. I brushed it off, blaming stress from interviews. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. I kept telling myself that I was doing the right thing, that the ends would justify the means. But as I looked at Melissa, so full of love and trust, I couldn't help but wonder, was I protecting her, or protecting my pride? It all came crashing down one evening, as secrets often do, in the most unexpected and humiliating way. I had been working at the warehouse for months, juggling shifts and job applications, trying to keep the charade alive. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I kept telling myself it was worth it. That keeping Melissa in the dark was the right thing to do. Then, one day, my carefully built house of cards collapsed. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had been called in to cover an extra shift. Melissa believed I was attending a networking event, something I had made up on the spot to explain my absence. I kissed her goodbye, grabbed my business folder, and headed out, feeling the familiar pang of guilt that had become my constant companion. The shift was uneventful. I spent hours lifting heavy boxes, stacking them onto pallets, and silently counting down the minutes until I could go home. When my shift finally ended, I grabbed my stuff, changed back into my professional clothes in the car, and headed out to pick up dinner for Melissa and me. As luck, or fate, would have it, Melissa had decided to surprise me. Unbeknownst to me, she had planned to drop by the networking event to bring me coffee and a snack. She'd called earlier, but I missed the call, busy hauling crates. So, she decided to track me down, thinking she'd surprise me and maybe meet some of the people I was networking with. What she found instead was me, in a bright orange safety vest, sweaty and grimy, carrying boxes onto a delivery truck. I didn't see her at first. But when I turned to grab the next load, there she was, standing near the open gate of the warehouse, holding a coffee cup in one hand and her purse in the other. Her expression wasn't angry, it was worse. It was a mix of shock and hurt, the kind that knocks the wind out of you before you even know what's happening. "Melissa," I said, my voice cracking as I dropped the box I was holding. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, her eyes wide and glistening. Then she asked, softly but firmly, "How long has this been going on?" I fumbled for words, my mind racing to come up with an explanation that didn't make me sound like a liar or a coward. But there was no way to sugarcoat it. "A few months," I admitted. I didn't want you to know." Her voice rose, trembling with emotion. "Didn't want me to know? Why, because you thought I'd judge you? Or because you didn't trust me?" "It's not that," I tried to explain, stepping closer. "I didn't want you to worry. I didn't want you to think less of me." She scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Think less of you? Do you really believe that little of me? That I wouldn't support you no matter what?" Before I could answer, the warehouse supervisor walked over, eyeing us curiously. "Is everything okay here, buddy?" he asked, looking from me to Melissa. I nodded quickly, wanting nothing more than to get out of there. "Yeah, it's fine. I'll finish my shift later." Melissa didn't say a word as I led her to the car. The drive home was silent, tension thick in the air. I could feel her anger radiating off her, but more than that, I could feel her hurt. That was what tore me apart the most. When we got home, she finally let loose. "You lied to me, Daniel," she said, pacing the living room. "Not once, not twice, but for months. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel?" "I wasn't trying to hurt you," I said, my voice breaking. I didn't want you to know because I was ashamed. I felt like I was failing you." She stopped pacing and turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. "Failing me? You think working hard to support us is failing me? The only thing that hurts is that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right. I had let my pride cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I had pushed her away. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was only protecting myself. I was scared, Melissa. Scared that you'd look at me differently." She walked over and took my hands in hers, her touch soft but firm. "Daniel," I married you because I love you, not because of the job you have or the money you make. I don't care if you're a loader or the CEO of a company. What matters to me is that we're honest with each other." Her words broke something in me, something I hadn't even realized I was holding on to. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. I pulled her into a tight hug, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. That night, we stayed up talking. I told her everything, how I'd been rejected from countless jobs, how I stumbled into the warehouse position, and how I'd been too ashamed to admit it. She listened without interrupting, her hand resting gently on mine. By the end of the conversation, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Melissa didn't judge me, didn't berate me. Instead, she made a plan with me. Together. "I believe in you," she said, her voice steady. "But you have to believe in yourself too." It wasn't the resolution I expected, but it was what I needed. Melissa's support reminded me of why I fell in love with her in the first place. For a moment, it felt like we were invincible again. After the night everything came to light, things began to shift between Melissa and me. It wasn't perfect, we still had long talks about trust and how we could move forward, but I could feel the weight of the secret lifting. For the first time in months, I felt like we were a team again, tackling life together. Melissa, being the ever-optimistic person she was, started brainstorming ways we could get out of the financial rut we were in. "You've got so much potential," she said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table. "I know you've been working so hard, but I think we should start thinking bigger." I nodded, not entirely sure what bigger meant. "What do you have in mind?" She smiled, that spark of determination in her eyes that I'd come to admire. "Why don't we look into starting a business? Something small but ours. It'll be a way to invest in ourselves and our future." The idea intrigued me, but it also terrified me. Starting a business was risky, and we didn't have much saved up. I voiced my concerns, but Melissa waved them away. "Every business has risks," she said. "But I believe in you, and in us." She wasn't just saying that, either. Over the next few days, she threw herself into research, reading articles and watching videos about small businesses. One evening, she approached me with a serious look on her face. "I think we should ask my dad for a loan," she said. The suggestion made me pause. Her father and I didn't exactly have the best relationship. He had always been polite but distant, his disapproval of me thinly veiled behind forced smiles. The thought of asking him for money made my stomach churn. "I don't know, Melissa," I said hesitantly. "Do you really think he'd go for that?" She reached across the table and took my hand. "I know my dad can be difficult. But he loves me, and I think he'll help us if he sees how serious we are about this. Let me handle it." True to her word, Melissa arranged a meeting with her father. She wanted me to come along, but I couldn't bring myself to face him. "You'll do better on your own," I said, trying to sound confident. "He listens to you." The day of the meeting, I waited at home, pacing the living room and mentally preparing myself for the worst. When Melissa finally walked through the door, she had a small smile on her face. "Well?" I asked, my voice filled with nervous anticipation. "He said yes," she said simply. I felt a rush of relief, but Melissa wasn't done. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "He had a lot of questions, wanted to know what kind of business we were thinking of and how we'd make it work. But in the end, he agreed to give us a loan, as long as we promised to pay it back within 3 years. I could hardly believe it. Her father had actually agreed to help us. That night, Melissa and I sat down to brainstorm ideas. We threw out everything from boutique shops to online services, but nothing felt quite right. Then Melissa said, "You know, you've always been great with people. And you've got a good eye for what works in a space. What about a cafe?" The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. A cafe. Of course. I loved the atmosphere of small coffee shops, the way they brought people together. I'd worked part-time at one during college and had always admired how the owner seemed to know everyone's name and order. A cafe, I repeated, the idea growing in my mind. Yeah, I think we could make that work. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning. We scouted locations, crunched numbers, and created a vision for what we wanted the cafe to be. Melissa handled the paperwork and licensing, while I focused on finding the right space. Eventually, we found it, a small storefront on a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't flashy or modern, but it had character. The moment I walked in, I could see the potential. We poured everything into the project. Melissa painted walls and helped pick out furniture, while I spent late nights researching suppliers and designing the menu. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were building something tangible, something that was ours. Opening day was a modest affair. We didn't have the budget for a grand launch, but we spread the word among friends and family. When the doors opened, I was nervous. What if no one came? What if we'd made a terrible mistake? But people did come. Customers trickled in slowly at first, but by the end of the day, the cafe was buzzing with conversation and the smell of fresh coffee. Melissa stayed by my side the entire time, her encouragement keeping me grounded. As we locked up that evening, I looked around the space, filled with gratitude. We did it, I said, pulling Melissa into a hug. No, she corrected, smiling up at me. You did it. I just believed in you. That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally on the right path. The cafe wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of everything Melissa and I had worked for together. But, as I would later learn, even the strongest symbols can crumble under the weight of unforeseen pressures. The cafe was more than just a business, it became the heart of our lives. Those early days were a blur of long hours and hard work, but they were also some of the most rewarding times I'd ever experienced. Melissa and I poured everything we had into making the cafe a success. I was there every morning at dawn, perfecting the coffee brewing process and training our small staff to make customers feel at home. Melissa took charge of marketing, designing flyers, managing social media, and ensuring that every detail reflected the cozy, welcoming atmosphere we wanted. And it worked. Word began to spread. At first, it was just locals from the neighborhood stopping by for a cup of coffee or a pastry. But soon, people from across the city were coming in, drawn by glowing reviews and recommendations. We became known for our personalized service and the kind of atmosphere that made people linger long after finishing their drinks. Within a year, the cafe wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. We started seeing regulars every day, and there were times when we barely had enough seats to accommodate everyone. It was a good problem to have, and it planted a seed in Melissa's mind. "Do you think we're ready for a second location?" she asked one evening as we sat in the cafe after closing. I looked around the space, still in awe of what we'd built. The idea of expanding felt daunting, but it also felt right. "I think we could do it," I said slowly, already imagining what a second cafe might look like. Melissa grinned, her excitement contagious. "Then let's do it." The next few months were just as hectic as when we opened our first cafe. We scoured the city for the perfect location, eventually finding a spot in a bustling downtown area. The rent was higher, and the stakes were greater, but we decided to take the leap. The second cafe opened to an even bigger reception than the first. By then, we had a reputation, and people were eager to see what we'd do next. The downtown location brought in a new crowd, young professionals looking for a place to grab coffee between meetings, students studying late into the evening, and couples on casual dates. It wasn't easy managing two locations. Melissa and I were constantly running between the two cafes, handling everything from staff training to supply logistics. But as exhausting as it was, it felt like we were on top of the world. The success of the second cafe made us realize we were onto something special. We had created not just a business, but a brand. People associated our cafes with comfort, community, and quality. It was Melissa's idea to lean into that, using the same homey decor and personalized touches in every location. Within another year, we were ready to open a third cafe. This time, we chose a residential neighborhood, similar to where we had started. The third location felt like a return to our roots, and it quickly became a favorite among families and retirees. With 3 cafes under our belt, Melissa and I had built something we were genuinely proud of. Our teamwork was stronger than ever, and I felt like we had finally found our rhythm, not just as business partners, but as husband and wife. But with growth came challenges. Managing 3 locations meant hiring more staff and trusting others to carry out our vision. It also meant that Melissa and I spent less time together, as we divided our attention between the cafes. Still, we were riding the high of our success, believing that nothing could slow us down. At the end of each long day, Melissa and I would sit together, going over numbers, brainstorming ideas, and talking about the future. We dreamed of opening even more locations, expanding our brand to other cities, maybe even franchising someday. "This is just the beginning," Melissa would say, her eyes lighting up with excitement. I believed her. At that moment, it felt like nothing could go wrong. But success has a way of revealing cracks that you don't notice when you're caught up in the excitement. And while our business was soaring, our relationship was slowly beginning to strain under the weight of our growing ambitions. By the time we opened the third cafe, Melissa and I had reached a level of financial security we'd only dreamed of when we first started. The profits from the cafes were steady and growing, and for the first time in our lives, we felt like we could afford to think long-term. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. It was Melissa who first brought up the idea of buying a new house. "We've done so much, Daniel," she said one evening as we sat on the couch, surrounded by paperwork and cafe invoices. "Don't you think it's time we did something for us? Something to show how far we've come?" I glanced around the cozy little house we'd been living in since our wedding. It had served us well, but it was starting to feel cramped with how much our lives had expanded. Melissa was right, we deserved to treat ourselves, to have a place that reflected the life we had built together. "Let's do it," I said, the words feeling both thrilling and terrifying. The house hunt became our newest project. Between managing 3 cafes and juggling staff schedules, we spent weekends touring properties and imagining what our future home could look like. Melissa threw herself into it with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else, researching neighborhoods, comparing amenities, and envisioning every detail. After weeks of searching, we found it, a beautiful 2-story house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It was everything we'd ever wanted, spacious but not overwhelming, with a modern kitchen, a cozy living room, and a backyard big enough to host friends or relax on quiet evenings. When we signed the papers, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This wasn't like the house her parents had given us as a wedding gift. This one was ours, bought with our own hard-earned money. The move was both exciting and exhausting. We packed up our old house with a mix of nostalgia and anticipation, reminiscing about the memories we'd made there while looking forward to a fresh start. On the day we officially moved in, Melissa stood in the empty living room, her hands on her hips, and said, "This is it, Daniel. We've made it." And it really felt like we had. At first, the new house was everything we'd hoped for. We spent weekends decorating, picking out furniture, and turning the space into a reflection of our journey together. Friends and family came over to admire the place, and for a while, life felt perfect. But then, something started to change. Melissa, who had always been so full of energy and excitement, began to withdraw. She stopped spending as much time at home, claiming she needed to stay late at the cafes to think of new ways to improve things. At first, I didn't question it. The cafes were her passion as much as mine, and I knew how dedicated she was to their success. But her absences grew longer and more frequent. She would leave early in the morning, saying she needed to oversee deliveries or train new staff, and sometimes she wouldn't come home until well after midnight. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off. "There's just so much to do," she'd say, her voice tinged with frustration. "You know how it is, Daniel. If we want to keep growing, we can't afford to slack off." I wanted to believe her, but something didn't feel right. The vibrant conversations we used to have about our dreams and plans became rare. When we were together, it felt like Melissa's mind was somewhere else, always preoccupied. She started skipping our usual date nights, saying she was too tired or had too much work to catch up on. I tried to be understanding, telling myself that this was just a phase, that the stress of managing 3 cafes was taking a toll on both of us. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. One night, as I sat alone in our big, empty house, I realized just how much things had changed. This house, which had once felt like a symbol of our success, was starting to feel more like a hollow shell. I missed her, the Melissa who used to laugh with me over burnt pancakes, who used to dream with me about what our future could look like. I told myself that once the cafes were running smoothly, things would go back to the way they were. But a part of me wondered, had we traded too much of ourselves for success? As the months dragged on, I couldn't ignore the growing distance between Melissa and me. The house we'd once celebrated as a symbol of our success was starting to feel more like a quiet, echoing space where we crossed paths but rarely connected. I missed her, her warmth, her laughter, the way she used to light up every room she walked into. So, when Melissa brought up the idea of hosting a New Year's Eve party, I felt a flicker of hope. "Daniel," she said one evening as we sat in the living room, her laptop balanced on her knees, "why don't we throw a party? Something big, to celebrate the new year. We could invite friends, family, staff from the cafes, just a way to bring everyone together." At first, I was hesitant. The idea of hosting a party when things felt so strained between us seemed risky. But then I thought about what she was really saying. Maybe this wasn't just about the new year, it was a chance to reset, to reconnect, to bring some joy back into our lives. "That's a great idea," I said, smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks. "Let's do it." Melissa's face lit up, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with. From that moment, the party became our project. Melissa dove headfirst into planning, creating spreadsheets and guest lists, designing invitations, and brainstorming themes. She wanted it to be perfect, a night to remember. "Let's make it elegant but fun," she said one evening, holding up swatches of fabric for tablecloths. "Think champagne, string lights, and a dance floor in the living room." I nodded, caught up in her enthusiasm. It felt good to see her excited again, to work on something together. We divided up the tasks. Melissa handled the decor and guest list, while I took charge of food, drinks, and logistics. The house buzzed with activity in the weeks leading up to the party. We rearranged furniture to make space for dancing, rented tables and chairs, and strung fairy lights across the backyard. Melissa even suggested setting up a photo booth with props, saying, "People love capturing memories at parties." As we worked side by side, I felt a sliver of hope returning. This was what we needed, a reason to laugh, to collaborate, to remember why we made such a great team. Melissa spent hours carefully curating the guest list, making sure to include a mix of old friends, cafe regulars, and family. "It'll be great," she said, her voice full of conviction. "We'll ring in the new year surrounded by people who've been part of our journey." I couldn't help but admire her vision. As much as things had been tough between us, Melissa had a way of making everything seem possible. We tackled the menu together, debating over appetizers and desserts. "What about those mini quiches you used to make?" Melissa asked, her eyes lighting up. "You know, the ones you made when we first moved into the house?" I laughed, surprised she remembered. "Those? They were a disaster. No, they weren't, she said, smiling. They were delicious. And besides, people love homemade touches. So, I added the quiches to the list, along with a few other crowd pleasers. We ordered champagne in bulk, stocked up on mixers, and created a playlist that included everything from old classics to upbeat party anthems. As the day of the party approached, the house began to transform. Decorations filled every corner, from glittering centerpieces on the tables to garlands draped across the stair railing. Melissa had even gone out of her way to buy sparklers for everyone to use at midnight. Watching her throw herself into the preparations, I felt a glimmer of the connection we used to share. There were moments, small ones, but meaningful, when we laughed together over a misprinted banner or shared a quiet moment setting up the dining table. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. This is going to be amazing, Melissa said the night before the party, standing in the middle of the living room with her hands on her hips, surveying our work. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Yeah, it is. Thank you for doing this. She leaned into me, her voice soft. It's been a long year, Daniel. I think we both need this. And I believed her. The party wasn't just about celebrating the new year, it was about us. A chance to let go of the past and start fresh, surrounded by the people who mattered to us. For the first time in a long time, I felt like things might finally be turning around. The night of the party arrived, and the house was alive with music, laughter, and the hum of conversation. Guests flooded in, dressed in their finest, holding bottles of wine and plates of desserts to share. Melissa had outdone herself. The decorations sparkled under the warm glow of the fairy lights, and the food and drinks were laid out in a way that would make any event planner jealous. For the first time in months, I felt like things were normal again. Melissa floated through the crowd with a radiant smile, chatting with guests and making sure everyone felt welcome. Every now and then, she'd shoot me a glance or a quick smile from across the room, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe that this party was the reset we needed. As the hours passed, the energy in the house grew. The playlist shifted from soft background music to lively dance tracks, and people began filling the makeshift dance floor in the living room. I made my rounds, catching up with old friends and introducing myself to some of the newer faces. But as the night went on, I started to notice that Melissa kept disappearing. One moment, she was next to me, laughing with a group of friends, and the next, she was nowhere to be found. I brushed it off at first, she was probably busy making sure everything was running smoothly. But after her third disappearance, I started to feel uneasy. I decided to look for her, weaving my way through the crowd and checking every room. The kitchen, the backyard, the guest rooms, she wasn't anywhere. Finally, I spotted her by the drinks table, laughing with one of my closest friends, Ethan. Ethan and I had been friends since college, and he was like a brother to me. He'd been a huge supporter of Melissa and me, always cheering us on and helping out whenever he could. Seeing the two of them talking didn't raise any alarms at first, but something about the way they stood, too close, too familiar, made my stomach churn. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was overthinking things. After all, it was New Year's Eve, and people were just letting loose and having a good time. As the clock neared midnight, Melissa finally returned to my side. She slipped her hand into mine, her smile bright and infectious. "This is it," she said as we watched the countdown on the TV. A new year, a fresh start. When the clock struck midnight, the room erupted into cheers and toasts. I kissed Melissa, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point for us. But my hope was short-lived. Not long after the countdown, Melissa disappeared again. This time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I excused myself from a conversation and began searching the house, my unease growing with every empty room I checked. When I reached the upstairs hallway, I noticed that the door to our bedroom was slightly ajar. My heart began to pound as I approached. The sound of muffled voices reached my ears, followed by a quiet, breathless laugh that made my stomach drop. I pushed the door open and froze. There, on our bed, was Melissa and Ethan. They were half-dressed, their bodies tangled together, lips locked in a kiss so passionate it made my chest ache. For a moment, I couldn't move. The scene before me felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but the betrayal was so visceral, so raw, that it felt like a physical blow. What the hell is this? I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and devastation. Melissa and Ethan broke apart, both of them scrambling to cover themselves. Daniel, wait, it's not what it looks like, Melissa started, her voice frantic. But I didn't want to hear it. All the hurt, confusion, and anger I'd been bottling up exploded in that moment. Without thinking, I lunged at Ethan, my fist connecting with his jaw. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his face. Get out! I roared, my voice shaking with fury. Get the hell out of my house. Ethan didn't argue. He grabbed his shirt and bolted, leaving Melissa and me alone in the room. I turned to her, my hands trembling, my chest heaving. How could you? I demanded, my voice breaking. How could you do this to me? To us? Melissa stood there, tears streaming down her face, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of regret or shame for being caught. Daniel, Don't, I said, cutting her off. I don't want to hear it. The woman I had built my life with, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And in that moment, everything I thought we had came crashing down around me. After Ethan fled the house, I stood in our bedroom, staring at Melissa as if she were a stranger. The room that had once been our sanctuary now felt cold and foreign, filled with the echoes of betrayal. Downstairs, the party was still alive with music and laughter, oblivious to the storm that had just erupted above. Melissa was crying, her face buried in her hands, but I didn't feel any sympathy. I was too raw, too consumed by the image of her and Ethan in the place where we'd built a life together. Daniel, please, let me explain, she said, her voice trembling. I shook my head, taking a step back as if the distance could somehow shield me from the hurt. Explain? I repeated bitterly. What exactly are you going to explain, Melissa? That you planned this party just so you could sneak off with my best friend? That the woman I've trusted for years has been lying to me this whole time? It's not like that, she insisted, her voice rising. I didn't plan for this to happen, I swear. It was a mistake, a stupid, horrible mistake. I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. A mistake? That wasn't a mistake, Melissa. That was a choice. You chose to betray me, in our home, during a party we were supposed to be hosting together. Do you even realize how disgusting that is? She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed into her hands. I didn't have the energy to comfort her, not anymore. My patience, my understanding, it was all gone. I turned and walked out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. Downstairs, the party was beginning to wind down. A few guests noticed the tension on my face as I passed by, but I forced a smile and assured them everything was fine. I didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want the humiliation of everyone knowing what had happened, at least not yet. As the last guests trickled out, I stood by the door, my arms crossed, barely acknowledging their goodbyes. The moment the house was empty, Melissa came downstairs, her eyes red and swollen. Daniel, can we talk now? Please, she asked, her voice hoarse. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to scream, to let all the anger and heartbreak pour out. But another part of me felt hollow, like I was too drained to fight anymore. There's nothing to talk about, Melissa, I said coldly. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. First thing in the morning, I'm filing for divorce. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. No, Daniel, you can't. Please, just give me a chance to explain, let me make this right. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady. Make this right? How? By pretending this never happened? By sweeping it under the rug so we can go back to pretending we're happy? No, Melissa. I deserve better than this. Better than you. She flinched at my words, her tears falling harder. It was a mistake, she repeated, her voice breaking. I wasn't thinking, I don't even know why I did it. But it didn't mean anything, Daniel. I swear, it didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? I snapped. It meant enough for you to throw away our marriage. It meant enough for you to betray me with the one person I thought I could trust. So don't stand there and tell me it didn't mean anything, because it sure as hell means something to me. The weight of my words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Melissa sank to her knees, clutching at my hands. Please, Daniel, she begged. Don't do this. Don't let this mistake ruin everything we've built together. I love you. I pulled my hands away, my chest tight with a mix of anger and sorrow. You don't get to say that, I said, my voice cold. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Not after what you've done. Without another word, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her sobbing on the floor. The next morning, I woke up feeling numb. Melissa was already awake, sitting silently at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She didn't say a word as I grabbed my jacket and car keys, but her eyes followed me as I left the house. The drive to the courthouse felt surreal, like I was floating outside of my own body. I replayed the events of the previous night over and over in my mind, the anger and betrayal simmering just beneath the surface. When I finally stood in front of the clerk and filed the paperwork, it felt like a weight had been lifted, but it also felt like a part of me had died. I walked out of the courthouse and sat in my car, staring at the folder in my hands. The words, "petition for divorce," stared back at me, cold and final. There was no going back now. The days following the New Year's party felt like I was living in someone else's life. The house that once felt warm and full of promise now echoed with silence. Melissa and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was strained and hollow. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter, untouched by her hands, a silent declaration that the life we'd built together was over. She tried, in her own way, to make amends. She left me notes apologizing, begging for another chance, and promising to do whatever it took to fix things. But every time I saw her handwriting, I felt a mix of anger and sorrow well up in me. Her words felt meaningless now. The betrayal wasn't something I could forget, or forgive. A week later, Melissa moved out. She packed her things quietly, avoiding eye contact as she carried boxes to her car. I didn't offer to help, and she didn't ask. When the door closed behind her for the last time, I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. I wasn't sure what life would look like without her, but I knew it was a life I needed to find on my own. The months that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. The divorce process was messy, as most are, but Melissa and I managed to keep it civil, for the most part. She tried to contest the terms, arguing for a larger share of our assets, citing her family's contributions to our first home and my cafe as reasons she deserved more. Her father even got involved, and it wasn't long before lawyers were trading sharp words over things that used to mean so much to us. In the end, Melissa took a significant portion of the business. She argued that she'd put just as much effort into building it as I had, and while I hated agreeing with her, she wasn't entirely wrong. I let her take it. I still had enough left to start over, a smaller cafe in a different part of the city. I poured everything I had into it, working long hours to build something new from the ground up. The work kept me grounded. It gave me purpose on days when the weight of the divorce felt unbearable. Slowly but surely, the new cafe began to thrive. The regulars became like family, and I found solace in their smiles and conversations. One evening, as I closed up shop, I sat at one of the tables, sipping the last cup of coffee for the day. My mind wandered back to everything that had happened, Melissa, the betrayal, the life we'd once shared. I couldn't lie to myself, part of me still missed her. Or maybe I just missed the version of her I thought I knew. The woman who laughed at my terrible jokes, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, who helped me build a life I never thought possible. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. As the months turned into a year, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The new cafe was doing well, and while I wasn't rolling in wealth, I was comfortable. I had my own place, a modest apartment that felt more like home than the big house ever did. I wasn't ready to start dating again, but I found joy in small things: reading a book at the end of the day, going for walks, and reconnecting with old friends. And slowly, the bitterness began to fade. I heard about Melissa occasionally, through mutual friends or snippets of gossip. She hadn't found another relationship, at least not a serious one. Her part of the business had struggled without the teamwork we'd once shared, and she eventually sold her share to someone else. I wondered if she ever regretted what happened, if she thought about me the way I sometimes thought about her. But I didn't dwell on it. That part of my life was behind me now. One day, as I was sweeping the cafe floor, a thought struck me, a simple, profound realization. I had survived. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the divorce, it hadn't destroyed me. It had hurt, yes, and there were days when I thought the pain might swallow me whole. But I had come out the other side, stronger and more self-assured than I'd ever been. I smiled to myself, setting the broom aside and flipping the cafe sign to "closed." My life wasn't perfect. It wasn't the life I'd once imagined with Melissa. But it was mine, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The past was behind me. The future was wide open. And this time, I was ready to face it on my own terms. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference.